Shopping, yeah. In the Oriental sense.
Well, I don't know, Oriental or not Oriental.
Let me say that, let me take an opportunity, and again, we'll just do it in the informal. I want to thank, again, the Outside Architecture program for funding this conference, or contributing a major part of its funding, and also General Studies for its contributions. General Studies has started a program in which a series of conferences about architecture's relationships to other developments and other disciplines has been begun at the school in order to try to stimulate a variety of discourses. The politics space was the last one, and then this conference. It's not there have been other conferences. Next fall, another conference is planned on relativism. And I think it will be interesting because, again, architects and experts from other disciplines, including Roberto Unger and Ways of World Building. Nelson Goodman, sorry. And other architects will gather together not only to discuss the question of relativism, but to discuss within that discussion, to take up the question of progress. So, as the conference becomes more concrete, further announcements will be made about it. I just wanted to situate our conference today in relationship to another series of conferences. On the particular issue of complexity, I should note, and I think many of you know that this conference should be also understood in terms of the series of lectures that Don Fraser organized last semester, basically on the idea of cellular automata and the impact on computing in architecture. And so we will also try to continue to develop this particular vein of thinking at the school. There's no reason to wait for Greg and Sanford, I'm sure. So, and I think I may at some point make a statement. Oh, I'm sorry. One other question. Some other people have asked about the fact that there was a lecture. I had a lecture scheduled. In fact, I was going to keep it open whether we wanted to have a panel discussion or a last talk. I think there's enough issues on the table, and I think a panel discussion is worthwhile.
I'll waive my 10 minutes for you.
No, I need much more than 10 minutes.
He'll waive his 10.
So I will schedule.
He'll even go sit over there.
I will schedule my own personal lecture for a full day in the near future, and I invite you all back to find out both what does complexity look like and what should it do. Are there questions for either Peter or Charles while we're waiting for everyone else to get that? For everyone else? I want to start with questions and then see if the questions can stimulate a discussion among the members of the panel. Do you want to go back to your?
One thing that comes to mind is that if this conference is about complexity, and so does it follow that it's about inclusion? Because it seems to me that in
I think that's a very good question.
In the presentations that have been made today, I'm sorry I was not able to be here yesterday afternoon, there has been a kind of playing out of what seems to me to be very standard practices, which is like you show one side of the story but you don't show the other. You talk about the outside of the building but you don't talk about the inside. You talk about the building on one side of the road but you don't turn the camera in the other direction. So it seems to me that what we've actually seen are a whole series of rather reductive and actually quite exclusive descriptions or discussions.
Okay, so you have both a question and a criticism. One is, your question is, to what extent is a meditation on complexity obligated to the question of inclusion, which I believe your question was, and I think your criticism was, if it follows that there will be a relationship, perhaps the conference failed to raise that issue. Anyone? Sanford.
Let me tell you what I think about that. Introduce.
Let me say this. Yes, I think over the 2 days, whether or not we've done a very good job at showing both the techniques of architectural inclusion and the techniques of presentations which would mobilize the thinking of the include its apparent successes in achieving those kind of communication.
It seems that, is that a fair statement?
The point was it started with the question about inclusion.
Yeah, we were talking about inclusiveness.
I still missed half of it this time around, but it seems to me that the optimistic side is that complexity theory frees us from certain determinism, from a certain type of, or a certain class of rules. I don't yet think, though I know that people like Ralph Abraham in Santa Cruz champions some writings of, for example, a woman named Rianne Eisler in a kind of sweeping reinterpretation of Western political history in terms of matriarchal cultures, and he embeds it all in, his work in morphodynamics. These are the excesses, the interesting and I would say necessary excesses that are brought along when fundamental cultural transformations take place. It allows one to speculate freely, and it allows one to begin to postulate possible revisionist understandings of things which for a long, long time were beyond the possibility of question. So I think it's a good question to ask, what does this mean for politics? But so far as I know, sadly, most of the creative speculation has gone into quasi-mystical domains rather than the hard political. And maybe Charles knows of some... Actually, I shouldn't say that. There are two very important articles. One is from pre-complexity days. It was by two French mathematicians named Rosenstiel and Petitot, who did a little work on cellular automata, who basically showed that systems, organized systems, did not need centralized government, for example. And it was a simple thing where they used the friendship theorem, and they used the firing squad theorem, and they solved it in such a way, a sort of a complexity theoretical way. Then there's the famous work by Garfinkel on the slime molds, where he basically tries to use the slime mold sociality as a model for non-statist social organizations. You could map that onto work of like Pierre Klastoff, for example, and you could begin probably to build a political worldview. But that's all I've got in my stores today on political.
Please.
Before I say anything, I'd like to thank Jeff for being a good translator and for helping organize this conference and making it hang together. So, thank you. Jeff, you've done a great job of translating questions and retranslating. I want to now disagree a little bit with you and say, and defend the idea that the complexity, or the sciences of complexity are postmodern, and say, first of all, that to borrow a page from the modernists, postmodernity, the unfinished project. When postmodernism was pronounced dead 10, 15 years ago, in the early 80s, then postmodernists started writing on the first period of its early postmodernism. And see that the 60s was the early postmodern period. And clearly that suffered its own kind of decline and going underground, as Rem would say. Anyway, to jump to the 80s, when the Santa Fe Institute started to get founded, and they saw the sciences of complexity, which I think was named by Murray Gell-Mann and Heinz Pagels, sort of conjointly, as the sciences of the 21st century. And also Prigogine, the Nobel laureate. All of them had seen these contrasts, which I brought out in my talk, between holism and emergent structures and so forth. All of those, things which are now canonic to complexity theory, and they've seen it historically developing out of thermodynamics, and they are looking for what's called the new second law of thermodynamics. And of course, that's an old search of the 19th century, in a sense. But it fundamentally overturns Newtonian mechanics and the Newtonian worldview. And I think that, to once again say what I said yesterday, is the Newtonian picture, the Galilean Newtonian picture did overturn this horrible phrase, the organismic worldview of the Aristotelian Middle Ages, and or the Gothic, or whatever one calls the Age of Faith. Since that, we have had, this is canonic, we have had a mechanistic, materialistic, reductivist, determinist worldview. And although many people protested within the West, where this worldview slowly became the dominant from the 15th century on, the protesters were not fundamentally listened to. So, and that's why the Romantic period, although it was hugely popular on one level, was still a recessive tradition. And then there have been other resistances to modernity, but basically it still is the dominant Western tradition. And that's why I get so worked up when I see Rem cryptically, although maybe not, and I don't know still, defending its late stage in, because so clearly what's called the world revolution of Westernization is modernization on the one hand, but it's what modernization in gray suits and pinstripe suits. In other words, it's not just modernization, it is covert Westernization. And this, every culture that's non-Western knows, but the West doesn't know. I mean, we aren't aware of it because we've been doing it for 400 or 500 years, but it's very clear that those cultures that have had to modernize, I don't think they've had much of a choice.
Can I interject there?
Yeah.
Because I think that this is exactly the bizarre. You are accusing me of kind of being condescending, but I think isn't that the kind of ultimate condescension to kind of say they don't even know that they're Westernizing and they don't do it deliberately. If anything is kind of very clear, is that it's a kind of very systematic, very deliberate, very conscious, and in every sense controlled operation over which we have already for a very long time lost any initiative and any power of steering. So I think it's really a completely absurd in that sense.
Well, Ram, in Japan, in the 11th century, we can have Chinese technology without Chinese culture. The same thing in the 19th century, when they will not accept Western culture, will accept their technology, their science, Westernized fundamentally, and right up to Maki, who, I've discussed it, and probably you've discussed it with Maki. It's always a question, Kirkhawa, they all say, does modernization entail Westernization or doesn't it?
Of course it does.
It does, you say.
Yeah.
All right.
But
well, a
it has-
lot
it
of
has
cultures have
already-
been sold modernization without Westernization. In other words, they don't realize it's a Mephistophelian deal. They just think we can be modernized and not Westernized.
No, but it's already long ago that you could call it legitimately Westernization. I mean, it's something that we maybe kind of triggered, but over which we have no influence anymore. And so therefore it's absurd to connect it to a kind of initial guilt or
It's
kind
not
of
triggered
initial...
by you, it's triggered by the breakaway. That's what's so interesting, is it's post-colonial.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
when you break away
Exactly.
from the Western rule that you take on their ways and habits.
In any case, it seems to me, whether it's conscious, unconscious, inevitable, not inevitable, it is something that the whole world is going through in continuation, and the waves of modernization, and they're tragic in many respects. So in the postmodern perspective, it's a question of also resistance, as well as allowing that it is a kind of process that happens. So it's a kind of double defense and resistance at the same time. It's a double movement. And I see that in your irony. Okay, so I think that in that sense you acknowledge it. But at the same time, you celebrate it for me too much. And this is where I want to ally myself more with Kwinter and Goodwin, whether or not they take that on. I mean, and go back to what he just said about Rianne Eisler. and the importance of thinking through a cosmogenetic structure, because that's, it's interesting that Einstein is one of the key characters, because he opened up postmodern science. Relativity theory did that, but he couldn't accept it. Remember, the important thing about Einstein was that in 1919, for the next 10 years, although his equations in the general and special theory of relativity showed that the universe was open, creative, and self-organizing, he couldn't accept that because he was such a strong Newtonian mechanist, determinist, who believed in a kind of the old one, as he called God, who set the thing in motion and who made it a closed universe, which would suffer the second law of thermodynamics. He falsified his equations. He put his cosmological. Wait, this is important because there's the ultimate paradox of this man, denying cosmogenesis. And it seems to me this is what's so exciting about the sciences of complexity, and why they're opening us out to a real universe, as you're saying, getting closer to the reality of the process. So I come back. The process is a reality.
Charles,
Yeah.
No one is arguing that they're not exciting. They're arguing about two things that I think that you've done. One is to assume, in a semantic level, that they can be collated with a cultural phenomenon called postmodernism. If it's just a matter of nomenclature, fine. If you mean by postmodernism after Newtonian, fine. But I think, for me and for this audience, postmodernism is indicative of many things other than simply the post-Newtonian conditions. It's indicative of an attitude about how political assemblies are arranged. It's an attitude about economics. It's an attitude about the nature of symbolic culture. And I think in that sense, we're resistant, for one, to any economy which would simply extend that argument. So if it's just a semantic term, I think we're in agreement with you. The other problem I think we have is that your assumption is that, and it may be a semantic mistake, that modernism is modern science and postmodernism in science is an attack on modernism in architecture. And I think that equation is far too simple. Far too simple, and I don't think it sustains critical judgment. I mean, I think that's the issue. It's not simply a semantic issue. It's not whether Einstein admitted or not the consequences of his equation. It's not whether the issues that we heard in the last 3 days are post-Newtonian. I mean, there's a larger project involved, and I think we need to be more detailed and a little more careful in our situation of it and architecture's relationship to it. So in a certain sense, many of the aspirations that could be rostered from the 2 days conferences of things that we would like to happen, Rem, I think, made a reasonably convincing argument, can be seen, if you look carefully, in Singapore. And for you to simply say that Singapore is indicative of both the costs and benefits of modernization, and therefore carries with it the ideological destitution of modernization, is a problem. Does that situate the problem any better? Mark?
This is really kind of addressed Charles. There's a warning that in Michel Foucault that kind of every time, like in the human sciences, and in kind of space of organized knowledge, that you hear someone saying that in some sense there's a scientific development which is going to resolve a whole lot of kind of theoretical issues. What you can put your money on is that in fact what you're getting is like a very old-fashioned philosophical solution. And I mean, I think that's kind of like the problem. I mean, there are some times in the last 2 days when I've been kind of a bit reminded, like in 1931, there was a conference in London about science, which is entirely to espouse the view that the bourgeois science, which actually is characterized very much in the way that Charles does, it's exploitative, it's mechanistic, etc., etc. But fortunately, it's now dead because although it wasn't kind of complexity that's put in its place, it happened to be dialectical materialism. But actually, some of your narrative of how the last 3 centuries have worked are perfectly recognizable from that kind of history where you suddenly say, you know, everything's resolved now because we've got like the dialectic. Now that kind of leads me on to the second point, which is really about the way in which the issue of complexity is handled across a whole number of different domains in which their specificity you know, isn't really kind of considered. And I think that ignores, in a way, a great deal of especially French philosophy of science in the last 30 years, which has been very concerned to point out that kind of sciences are not in some simple kind of English way of thinking about it, an appropriation of the real, but they are distinct forms of knowledge with their own objects, their own modes of investigation, their own forms of evidentiation, etc. And that you can't, you know, so the question about complexity there is, how do you deal? You can't just say there's something called complexity without it falling, in fact, into an extremely base empiricism, where you're just saying, well, actually the world's terribly complicated out there, and we've got to have new ways, or kind of a new theme with which to grasp it. The last point I want to make is really the connection perhaps to what kind of David raised as an issue. Because although it's never been explicitly said, there have been from time to time like a suggestion that the deployment of the concept of complexity has, to put it very crudely, advantageous architectural, social and political benefits. Now I assume by that some semi-conscious link is being drawn between the idea of complexity in the field of natural phenomena and the idea of, in some sense, heterogeneity, or the representation of differences in the kind of social world. And yet, actually, it seems to me one would need to be extremely careful before making that turn, which I think Greg's quite right about, before moving from the one into a set of theoretical analogues in the social sciences, where it does seem to me that smart forms of social science are not concerned with crude materialist forms of explanation. They are highly provisional forms of analysis which take the question of causality and indeterminacy as kind of central to the form of analysis which they make. So really there are sort of three strands to what I think, you know, it would be pity if what's lost is the actual detailed analysis of the question of complexity, lest a kind of optimism swamp it, because that optimism will automatically be followed next year by a vast disappointment, because no one here will have worked through the actual issues.
Do you want to summarize that?
No, I think Mark speaks in self-summary.
Well, let me just quickly answer that because it's directed at me. I didn't answer Jeff either, and I don't want to take too much time. But I do disagree with the characterization. I'm not arguing that that science is the metanarrative, and that there's a simple science is complexity solves it all. But I am saying that, first of all, because I think that it's quite clear that scientists like Einstein misunderstand themselves and the social, political, religious, etc. implications often of their object language, even when they so brilliantly invented or refined it. So I agree with you that there's no straightforward and simple connection either between complexity sciences and heterogeneous architecture. I agree one must look at it in specificity and detail, and I'm not trying to advocate a yin and yang approach to history that we've, after 300 years. Although, at the same time, there is, I believe, in long wave, and I do believe that that worldviews and paradigms exist. The things, so that there is something it makes sense to call the modern age, and historians date it basically from 1450 in the nation state, in economics, and architectural historians have dated in the 1780s. And so you even see in those differences in dates the different theories that they're working on, what the modern and what modernity and modernization are. Now, you know, I don't want to get into a long thing on this, but I have to say, just to end by saying, there are three things here. There's modernity, that is the spirit of society and the new and the change. There is modernism, which is the cultural expression of modernity, and there's modernization, which is industrialization and progressivist ideology. At the same time, there are three aspects of postmodernity, postmodernism, and postmodernization. And so already it's a complex thing, worldview, but it is changing, and I believe that one can talk about the long historical change.
I'm going to turn our attention to another subject which I think arose during the day, and I think it's important to talk about, and I'm going to pick up a moment from Mark's comments. Because architecture is not applied science or applied anything else. It, like every other discipline, well-formed discipline, is a form of knowledge in its own right and in its own movements. And I thought one of the debates today that I thought we should probably spend some moments on and discuss with the audience is the debate between essentially the affective and the effective behavior of architecture. And let me roughly align, let's say, Charles, Peter, and Greg with the idea that the most important moment in design, not the only moment, but one of its most important modes of behavior is representational, and that new forms, new aesthetics, new organizational arrangements are crucial to the questions that we're undertaking. Whereas it seemed to me that in different ways, Rem and Sanford were indicating that it's not that, it's actually the effective behavior, new dynamic arrangements of programming, new rules which allow land to be developed differently or events to occur in a different way, new algorithms, or because I think what Rem said, he didn't say Singapore was mediocre. He said the form or the formal language may be mediocre, but what he was particularly interested in was the event structure. And so architects are simultaneously concerned with the affective and effective dimension. And I think it seemed to me that a reasonably interesting debate on those terms in the context of what we were discussing emerged. And so I'm going to ask Peter to comment on that, because I think Peter is probably the most insistent advocate of the expressive capacity.
I would argue, Jeff, that what Rem was complaining about, the mediocrity of Singapore, was precisely the affective dimension of Singapore, not the dynamic dimension. And I would go further to say that with the emergence of what I would call the mediated environment, the electronic paradigm that we seem to be caught in, that there's even more of a need for some evocation of an affective environment, because what has happened is that the mediated discourses tend to reduce the possibility of affective interaction, especially bodily affective interactions. And what I would argue is that if we do not have some sort of formal space that clearly recognizes the need for affective being, and merely take it as effective, architecture will be erased. And I think that architecture is the only physical embodiment that I know of affective space today. And so I, more than ever, believe that the affective dimension needs, and I think this is where Rem and I truly do come unstuck. And that's fine. I mean, I've always admired the difference. I sharpen myself on that difference, but I don't mind it. And as a matter of fact, as I told you, I'm finally, as it were, coming out of the closet and writing the book on formalism that I always wanted to write, because I think it's an affective tyrannical. Yeah, an affective moment to do so.
By the way, this is now the time when audience is invited not only to ask questions, but to make polemic speeches, to do what you've been wanting to do for 2 days. Nicholas? something I thought was quite provocative. He said hierarchies are interesting, that we are interested in them. That it's not just that they're effective,
Well, they're
or,
creative.
And when I think the most interesting thing I saw in all of the video presentations was the 10,000 dot explosion, where 10,000 dots, which started as a dot, went to the tube and then developed into quite complex or quite sophisticated formal arrangements. Now, the reason we find that, and interesting is a component of affect. The reason we find those interesting cannot be dismissed. The finding of something interesting.
Do you know why it's
formally,
interesting?
I believe, for example, it's indicative, and I think you have to change language from indicative representation to indicative. It's an indicative of an interest in more liquid hierarchies which are no longer seen in received institutional types, but nevertheless are able to offer both the representation and the possibility of ordering. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to the status of that issue, because it's one you conspicuously position yourself against.
What I was about, the second half of what I was going to say is interesting about complexity theory is the insistence on depth. The third thing would be the insistence on the whole. But you see, those images were tantalizing.
But you also
And
refer to
those
them
were-
as superficial, sexy,
No.
and a kind of sleazy attractive.
Yes, no. To you, yes. To me, no. There's a difference. Because that's, I mean, I was spellbound by that demonstration. But what I saw in it was something that took me 3 months of work to understand. What we saw there was the breaking of forms, the exfoliation and the retroactive smoothing, to use purely technical language, okay, from catastrophe theory. Now, the depth of the depth in the system from which the forces which were acting on those forms, from which they came, is really enormous. I mean, in some way it was I'm at a loss here for an adjective, but it was awesome. Now, I think that the forms themselves mean nothing unless there's the understanding of how they're enracinated, how they belong to a really profound and even platonic.
But your own statement vitiates that, because you didn't say those are profoundly interesting consequences of a depth investigation. You said they were clearly sleazy, attractive, and I think everyone here understood what you were
At the end of my lecture, I said that what complexity looks like, we had all seen. But some of us see it and some of us recognize it. And what I said is it's important to hold back from the premature ejaculation, let's say, because there is a lot of research that needs to be done, because there's a lot of intuition that needs to be built to connect where that breaking comes from and where it emerges.
Greg, hop in any time, folks. Raoul, after Greg.
To go back to Jeff, your question, which I think, I'm not sure who's constructing this trap, but it's the third time I've seen it happen whenever Jeff and Sanford are at the same place at the same conference, and that's that Sanford is proposing, I think, in the same way that a lot of the instances of what's been called complexity proposes compositional systems. Right? I mean, that's one thing I think is very clear. It's a way of talking about composition and organization, not form as in a style or a set of types, but compositional logics. Now, Sanford, you always refuse. I've also never seen people so voraciously pursue someone to give them an image as Sanford. I mean, it's been maybe 4 or 5 years since you leaked a René Thom catastrophe diagram that everyone's been saying, show us what it looks like, and you keep saying, well, it looks like a compositional logic, and everyone keeps saying, well, give us the image of what it looks like.
Yeah, but I once said it, and people were impressed. I once explained what I thought it looked like, and people were impressed. But the point is it looks like a lot of things.
I understand, but there's a kind of circularity going on that's actually allowing Jeff, your kind of, by subterfuge, bringing in this whole issue of program, which is that, well, if it doesn't look like anything, it must have to do with all of the architectural techniques that don't ever yield form, which is program. And I think that's actually simplifying the argument far too much to make this distinction between effects, affects, and form, to say that we'll program. The whole point of the last 2 days, I thought, was to say that all of these extraneous forces could be programmed, could be whatever. are influencing the composition of form. So I mean, to try to split it and then have a discussion with things split like that,
No, I thought it was
I think kind
important
of
to
puts
shift
everyone in a difficult position, especially Sanford.
But I thought it was important perhaps to shift from a discussion of form and program, where I agree, to a discussion of affect and effect. And one of the things I think, for 2 days we've heard of scientists and architects saying we need to pay more attention to the facts of reality in a certain sense, not idealize them, not call variance. And it seems to me that the specific moments of attractiveness of certain formal arrangements is a fact that has to be paid attention to. Fashion is a fact that has to be paid attention to. And the best account, by the way, of fashion that's been given is in complexity theory. Why it is that certain styles and certain forms are able to attract so much attention for a brief period of time comes out of that kind of modeling. So I'm very interested in the persistent desire to keep this one aspect of architecture subordinated to anything else and everything else, whether it's to avoid the problematic or to claim the problematic in political terms or to claim the problematic in programmatic terms, but anything whatsoever to make sure we don't have to deal with this one aspect of architecture, which in a sense predominates its other features. Raul? I'm sorry. 10 more, 15 minutes, so get ready for your polemic attacks.
I just want to continue that point I made before about the private use of complexity. That I asked Sanford to be more critical. I think there's a possibility of using what we learned from complexity theory, if that exists, to construct models to create readings of situations that may be complex or that we simply don't understand and which we can make visible or communicable through these models. For example, I'm involved at the moment in 2 small cities in Russia that emerge out of the Soviet period, and the problems are immense and complex and multiple. Perhaps there, I would say, on that urban scale, yes, you must perhaps even use the models that complexity gives us to understand, or even at least to describe the situation. Now, to go back to your arguments, the form that emerges out of the way you describe complexity is something that evolves. It's ultimately something that bifurcates, constantly mutates, therefore it's not teleological. Right? Now, on that point, I would say, yes, that's why it's a good description of the model, like I think Ram was doing it go, but I think there it's useful, where I think it's not useful and even dangerous if it becomes privatized and it's turned into a design logic. This is maybe directed towards Greg, where in a way it becomes purely teleological. It simply ends in a fixed form which is somehow articulate, like architectural buildings are. They are articulated, and we always use metaphors to create an articulation stories. But I think where perhaps some of the conditions, and not, I would say, not complexity, it's not a thing, or some of the conditions that I think Sanford was describing, perhaps the most clearest, are useful, is to give to architecture a larger, more complex scale, let's say urbanity, the possibility for it itself to describe alternative versions of itself, and perhaps to even to choose them intuitively, or at least to follow some configurations within. But the question would go back to Rem, okay, what next? How would you as an architect act within this complex model? And I think there, the architect becomes an actor within that simulation itself. Would either you or perhaps Greg?
Yeah, I'm going to just hand this mic to Greg. but while saying one thing, is that I think, in defense of Greg, I mean, your statements are really well taken, and I think I will always defend research over strict and rigid formulations. And what I see Greg doing is setting up a laboratory. And what I saw him giving us today was the results of a certain period of research. For example, when Goodman presented us his worlds and the breaking worlds, that stuff was published in 1985. And it was republished in the recent Roger Lewin book. In a certain sense, it's an emblem of a general set of problems upon which he's working, and that's why he continues to present them. So I didn't look at Greg's presentation, and I wasn't able to be critical of it, only fascinated and finally full of admiration for the fact that he wasn't interested in stating anything more, but this is what applied intelligence in a field of material speculation looks like, and this is what I've done. Now, Greg, I hope you have something nice to say about it.
Well, thanks. That's very flattering. The only thing I have a real problem with is metaphor. I'm not sure about how you're using the word metaphor. My relationship to any of these sciences is very peripheral at best, and I think I'm looking for those habits in architecture that are already there and trying to look at ways in which those things can be moved. So if in the end buildings are always going to be static and not evolve, which I think, it's one of the things that was debated in a very excellent way. I don't really subscribe to that. But if that's the case, there are still certain design time evolutionary models that are put into play. Variation in type is one of those things, and so that's one of the things I'm trying to work on, is how could a rethinking of variation and difference and symmetry and all these things that are already very normative to architecture. Symmetry, segmentarity, all of those things are things we deploy all the time when maybe one of these complex urban planning proposals would get implemented. So, I would say that I'm not dealing with something at the scale of Singapore, at that urban level, but I'm trying to locate those instances in architecture where something could be gained in an opportunistic way from some of these findings. But
so maybe that in the description, for example, I'm not criticizing your form, because I subscribe, of course, once you make your building, somehow you have to write your form. But I wonder, for example, in your urban project, which was first you took very little time, and then take more time. But I wonder if you enter there any of the models of let's say, complex forms that we have heard descriptions of, whether you can restrict yourself so much in your representation, your visual representation. Whereas the description of form there was purely a massing within the city.
Right.
Is that enough, as it were, to allow the thing to mutate, for example? I'm sure there's more work in all of that. So.
No, the first two projects were zoning projects. The Cabrini project was really, all they wanted was a zoning plan, one sheet that would locate programmatic distribution. So, that was, in a certain way, I really feel complicit with a lot of these things, but that was something I just took. I just said it's going to have to be on one sheet, it's going to have to be a single plan, and it's going to have to only be a programmatic distribution. With height, it was simply extruded. So, you're absolutely right. There are extreme limits. But I would want to say that in each of the projects, I'm trying to bracket certain moments that we use as architects. And when Sanford calls it a laboratory, that's exactly the mode I'm in. I'm trying to develop a series of techniques. If for some reason someone offered me a building commission, I would have to think very seriously about where those brackets would fall. But right now, what's good about these competitions is I can really delimit things and work in a very isolated way, I think.
Don?
This is a slightly different direction. I just wanted to, perhaps going back a little bit to when you mentioned about attractiveness or attraction, and also the word visibility has come up a lot. I wanted to also bring in another word, which I think almost everybody, perhaps Rim didn't use the word, but everybody used another word beyond the word of complexity, which was the word of geometry in all of the presentations. And it seemed to me that in a certain way, whether it was the architects or whether it was the biologists or whether it was the social scientists, that geometry was being given a kind of definition of being in effect, the visibility of orders and organizations. And I'm just curious, one, to have a better, maybe not to do a survey, but to have a better definition of what is geometry, other than the most simplistic way in which it's probably used in this building. But also, if one changes the orders and the organizations, does one always have to have a geometry?
I'd like to answer that in part with, I think it's the title of Benoit Mandelbrot's book called The Fractal Geometry of Nature. And suggest, once again, that there are geometries coming out of complexity theory, which are fashionable, and we've looked at a lot of them in the last 2 days. And in fact, they constitute part of an iconography, something we haven't been mentioning. Alan Cahoon wrote a paper back in the 60s, I think, on this question, which was very hard for modernists to face. Not so much in what style will you build, but what will your building be about? Because there is an arbitrary dimension to any architecture. It's language. It's always an element of freedom, an element of choice, an element of decision, an element of fatality. Is it going to be biomorphic? Is it going to be geometric? Is it going to be fractal? Is it going to be full of wave patterns? Is it going to be full of solitons? Is it going to be full of tubes? Or frozen ants, or frozen music, or frozen this and that? Clearly, as an architectural profession, we do have some choice and some responsibility. And it's an anxiety because we have that choice. In other words, it's what used to be called in this building by Banham art worry. We are responsible. Society expects us to come to some decisions on this and come to them rationally and in public. They aren't private decisions, they're public decisions. And partly what excites me about the complexity sciences is that they are stimulating a whole new set of language choices here, which I would argue are really closer to real nature, even given the fact that, of course, the word real there has to be in cultural quotation marks, because it's real as we see it now in 1994. And I'm sure all of you out there are thinking, well, just as Bruce Goff's style is so 50s, and that's how he saw fractal geometry, we can always identify it as 50s, are, the way that Peter's doing twists and Greg is doing twists and I'm doing twists is all different, but, there's very much 1992 to 4 written all over it. So that it has a cultural component, yes. But there's also a universal component, and I want to look at that for a second, because I think it is cosmogenetic, and that, in that sense, also exciting. Take these fractal pictures of London, which are beginning to emerge from satellite photography plus computer imaging, and you'll see that it looks like the ants again. They're pockets of predictability around Buckingham Palace, let us say. Pockets of predictability around, Oxford Street. There's certain things where the ants always form similar kinds of lines for at least 100 years, and then there are other pockets of, the ants are running all over the place, and it is pretty chaotic. But there are, in other words, there are islands of stability in seas of chaos, and we're not quite in control, even if we're in Singapore, because even though they're in more control than any other city-state in the world, they're still responding to a world market. So we live in a cosmogenetic economic society. We as architects are trying to be public in part and say, and this is where, as far as I'm concerned, we propose a language of architecture which is represents the wave aspect of reality, the becoming aspect of reality, the process aspect of reality, because that is closer to the cosmos as we understand it, not necessarily taking it direct from scientists, but interpreting what they're doing. And in that sense, and this is where I started off yesterday, it is a spiritual rather than savage process. I say to be subversive to Peter, because he puts subversion up there with God. In the beginning was subversion and savageness. I think, Peter, you're a romantic who, you know, if you're coming out of the closet today and say you're going to declare your interest in formalism, I would say if you had not been shopping yesterday when I was talking, and I dedicated my talk to you and Peter Fuller, I think that what you do is very spiritual, because I know this is highly subversive to your self-image, because it's inventive. It is creativity in action, and that's what cosmogenesis is, among other things. I mean, there are so-called laws and rules too, but basically, fundamentally, the universe is jumping. And your architecture represents that. And that's what excites me about it, and I think it's fundamentally spiritual and not savage.
Why do they contradict each other?
This is going to be great, because Peter would really like to have the last word here.
No.
No.
And I'm not going to let him. Something I've really been desiring to stop for a long time. I thanked most of the visitors profusely and all the support. There's one last thanks I'd like to give as we close, and that's to an audience which is essentially and generously given us attention for 15 out of the last 36 hours. I think you've been a fantastic audience. I really appreciate it. And so let me give you my last gratitude and thank you. Good night.